Ms. Indrani Bagchi is a senior diplomatic editor with the Times of India, where she reports and analyzes foreign policy issues for the newspaper. Ms. Bagchi covers daily news on foreign affairs, the Foreign Office, as well as interpreting and analyzing global trends with an Indian perspective. She writes news stories, opinion articles, news features, and a blog, Globe Spotting. She joined the Times of India in 2004. Earlier, Ms. Bagchi was associate editor for India Today, a premier news magazine. She started her journalism career at The Statesman, where she was the weekend editor before moving to the Economic Times in Calcutta to edit the Metro magazine. She's a fellow of the Kamal Nayan Bajaj Fellowship and a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. So welcome to the session, The United States in the Coming Decades, Opportunities and Challenges for India. Over to you, Indrani.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session. We have a stellar group or panel of speakers. So I will not stand in the way of between you and the speakers. Just to give a short introduction, this is a good day to be talking about the Indo-US relationship. Joe Biden finishes 100 days in office, and we have seen a lot of continuity. Some would say a lot more predictable and a lot more mature administration in the US right now. We have seen an interest and a focus on the Quad and the Indo-Pacific by the Biden administration, sort of putting at rest a lot of speculation from people who thought that Indo-Pacific being a Trump thing, Biden would not be interested in it. He clearly showed them where the center of his foreign policy lies, and it is in the Indo-Pacific. Biden has also bitten the bullet on Afghanistan, and all of these present both opportunities and challenges for Indian foreign policy. This week, we went through a little bit of a COVID gasp between India and the US. For some would say a delayed response by the US to India's current COVID surge and the humanitarian crisis that we can all see in front of us. But to take you through how US could evolve in the coming decades and what that would mean for Indian foreign policy, may I call upon former ambassador to the US, France and Israel, Ambassador Arun Singh. Arun, please unmute yourself and welcome.
Thank you, Indrani. Thank you for this opportunity. And I'm sure my co-panelists, Dr. Monish and my colleague, Ambassador Sarna, will elaborate in detail on different aspects of the India-US relationship. I just wanted to focus on a few issues looking at the strategic perspective. One, you referred to the US first hesitant, now forthcoming response in the context of the COVID challenge we are facing in India. That itself reflected many things. The first hesitation reflected the lingering effects of Trump's America First policy and the whole concept of a supply-side nationalism. And then the kind of response with which the administration came forward, and not just one branch of government, but all branches of US government, and not just the government. You had appeals from the US Congress, key senators, the US private sector stepped forward. So it reflects the fact that now there are many stakeholders in the US invested in the India relationship. So I think going ahead, that's a dimension that we can use because there will be times when some segments in US society may not agree or may not be supportive of some issues that may be in India's interest, and we will have to leverage our stakes in different facets of US society. And again, we had found that in 2016, February, when the Obama administration had decided to supply F-16 aircraft to Pakistan, hoping that thereby they would incentivize Pakistan to be more supportive of the US in the context of Afghanistan. And the Indian government, the Indian embassy, lobbied heavily the US Congress and through that was able to block that supply of F-16. So I think it shows that now we have leverage in the US system that we can play. So that's one dimension. The second dimension I wanted to refer to was the Indo-Pacific. Historically, having studied deeply the India-US relationship, I have found that through time, 4 factors have influenced the relationship at any point of time. And if you look at it in the context of these 4 factors, you can explain US decisions at any point of time. And these are: 1, what is US global priority at a moment? Second, in the context of that global priority, what is the role that it sees for Pakistan? And then that clearly impacts on us. Third, again, within the framework of its global priority, what is the relationship between US and China? And that impacts on us. And finally, what is the strength in the bilateral relationship? Now, in the current context, the overarching priority for the US is to deal with the challenge from China, the economic, military, technological challenge. And that is something they have said repeatedly. The Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, if you saw that the US new administration has put out an interim national security guidance, because every new administration comes with a national security strategy. And the Trump administration had done that in December 2017. And the new administration has said that their new strategy will come a few months down the line, but they didn't want to wait because they wanted to signal how they are different from the Trump administration, what is going to be their priority. So they came out with this interim national security strategy document. And it is clearly elaborated there that for them, the main challenge, which they have described at different times, that the main challenge in the 21st century that the US will face will be the challenge from China. Now, given this challenge, which I said is economic, military, technological, US does and will see India as an important partner, not to contain or push back on China, but as they say, to shape the environment around the rise of China. And if you see the steps that the US has taken since then, Joe Biden convened the first summit-level meeting of Quad countries. And he said in the meeting that this was his first multilateral meeting that he was hosting. US Secretary of State, after speaking to our foreign minister, said that India is going to be the preeminent partner for the US in the context of the Asia Pacific. Before the meeting with the Chinese counterparts in Alaska, they deliberately wanted to hold 2+2 meetings with Japan and South Korea as a signal to China that they'd met their allies before coming to meet them. And again, while Blinken headed back to Alaska for the meeting, the Secretary of Defense came to India and had a meeting to reinforce that they see India as an important partner in the bilateral context and, of course, in the context of China. So given that, and I think given the challenges we are facing ourselves in our relationship with China's unilateral assertions along our line of control, their efforts to block India in different fora, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, India's interest in the context of the Security Council and elsewhere, and supportive generally of Pakistan in its efforts at the UN. So I think there will be a certain convergence of interest. There will be differences because each country's national interest will have elements of difference, but there will be a lot of convergence, which will provide a framework for the two to work together. The third I want to refer to is Russia, and that's a challenge we are going to face because we have a very strong relationship with Russia. It is, although we are buying more and more from the US, we're buying more from France, we've now been buying a lot from Israel for quite some time. Russia still remains a very important source of defense supplies for India. And more than 60% of our defense inventory is of Russian origin. When we had the standoff with China last year, it was critical for us to get continued supplies from Russia, and Russia reassured India. Again, in the India-China context, we would not like Russia to go completely on the side of China, because otherwise they are getting a certain dependence on China and link it with China because of the pushback they are facing in US and in Europe. Now, Joe Biden and his administration have signaled that they will continue to take actions against Russia, even while they're making efforts to have some element of cooperation in the relationship through extension of the START. Joe Biden has invited Putin for a summit-level meeting. Putin has not responded positively so far. But as he said also in his message to the Congress today, that Russia, from their perspective, has interfered in the elections in the US. Russia has done cyber hacking of the US government and the private sector, and therefore they will take steps against Russia. So in that context, the US, for its own reasons, will have anxieties related to some aspects of defense cooperation with Russia, where they believe or they have assessed that the level of technology that they can share with us could get compromised if India is fielding both Russian and US systems. And that's the argument in the context of S-400. And so going ahead, India will need to make choices at the margin because Russia is an important defense partner. Russia has been a consistent supporter. You don't want Russia to become completely dependent on China. You don't want Russia to start playing up the relationship with Pakistan in the context of India. There's a very strong energy partnership with investments by Russian companies in India, Indian companies in Russia for energy. And at the same time, if you look at the broader comprehensive dimension of the relationship, in terms of trade relationship, US is the largest partner. In terms of investment flows, US remains the largest partner. In terms of potential civilian technology partnerships, it is partnership with the US. For example, the IT sector in India generates 10% of our GDP. But the bulk of our production in the IT sector is exported, and it's exported to the United States. If you look at the Indian origin diaspora, it is the US, which is the single largest host, largest host in terms of one country for Indian origin diaspora. If you look at startup cooperation, again, you're looking at Israel, you're looking at United States. So in many dimensions, the US relationship will be critical, and therefore the policymakers in India will face this dilemma that as you move both with US and Russia, how do you make sure that each choice that you make does not constrain your options vis-a-vis the other? And the fourth element that I'd like to refer to is the Afghanistan-Pakistan dimension. Because the US is leaving Afghanistan, and at least in terms of a formal troop presence, some kind of undeclared presence could be there, intelligence, contractors, etc. And again, as Joe Biden said in his message to the Congress today, they will maintain an over-the-horizon presence so as to ensure that American interests are not adversely affected. But that having said, they're leaving. Now, once they leave, we will have to see what happens in Afghanistan. Is there a stable, inclusive government? Or is it that the Taliban is encouraged by the withdrawal of the US, sees that it has won the war, is supported by Pakistan, and tries to establish a unilateral, coercive government in Afghanistan, which could lead to civil war? Now, if that happens, India's interest would be negatively impacted. Then does it lead to isolation of the Taliban? We don't know. We'll have to see. Or will people just recognize the power reality on the ground? What happens to perceptions related to Pakistan if it is seen as the only or the main backer of the Taliban? How does it play out in Pakistan? So I think these dimensions and how the US responds to those will have an impact also in the relationship. And the final point I wanted to make was related to the economic aspect of the relationship. There's growing strategic political convergence between India and the US. But the economic relationship, if you look at, for example, China's trade with the US is $500 billion. India's trade with the US, $150 billion. Now, a large figure in terms of India's trade, but not so large in terms of the US trade. And even this trade figure, the positive momentum is that it has grown 7 times in the last 20 years. But we are finding it difficult even to negotiate small trade agreements because there are existing interests on both sides which work to thwart new agreements coming into play. So I believe that both countries should look at catalyzing, incentivizing cooperation in new and emerging technologies. Everybody has said that there is a perfect storm of technology coming, AI, quantum, biotech, cyber. That will completely change the way we live, the way we work. And I think it makes sense for us to encourage engagement between the Indian and the US private sector in these areas so that new frameworks for interaction are encouraged, so that new patterns of economic relationships are established, which will enable us to harmonize our positions on regulation, and that will lead to new opportunities for trade and economic cooperation. And that would be a way of giving a geo-economic ballast to the geopolitical convergence that we are having with the US. So these are some of the issues that I wanted to flag for you and the others as we look at strategic aspects of cooperation between India and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. But before I move on, I just wanted to ask you if you would like to talk about a little bit, if you've thought about something that the pandemic brought into the economic lexicon, which is global trusted supply chains, trusted technology partners. And one of the things that, and you referred to this as when you talked about the perfect storm of technology that is coming our way, Joe Biden has also spoken about the technology alliances, the techno alliances. And all of last year, one of the things that we learned, one of the first things we learned from the pandemic was the diversification of supply chains from China and the creation of trusted supply chains. In the current context, and where we have not been able to negotiate, as you correctly said, even a mini trade deal with the US, what are the prospects of the Indian-US economic relationship in these areas?
So Indrani, I think we have to work for a trusted, secure supply chain relationship. The Indian Prime Minister also, while he has referred to Atmanirbhar Bharat, has spoken about a trusted supply chain relationship, because we can't do everything in India. You need the wider markets. And because the US is now concerned about intellectual property theft by China, forced technology transfers, subsidies. They saw the kind of dependence they had on medical supplies from China in the initial phase of the COVID. There is talk of diversifying the supply chain. At the same time, if you look at the data, most companies who are at the moment, US companies included, invested in China are not moving out because they see the Chinese market. But certainly a level of uncertainty has been created in their minds about the future direction of the US-China relationship. Therefore, when they're looking at new investments, they will look twice before investing in China in the newer areas and in higher levels of technology. So I think that is going to create opportunity. And we all need to seize that. But there will be challenges, because I think the Joe Biden administration is emerging from the experience of the Trump administration. And they have found, for example, that although President Trump lost, he got 74 million votes in 2020, 11 million more than he had got in 2016, when it was 63 million. Of course, Joe Biden got 81 million. So there are a lot of people in the US who felt that the earlier phase of globalization in the US post the dissolution of the Soviet Union had not worked for them. And therefore, the concept of Buy America works for them. And even today's message to the US Congress, Joe Biden again spoke about Buy America, although he said it would be limited to US tax dollars. So there is this debate, but at the same time, I want to draw attention to the fact that the US Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, at her confirmation hearing, said that she didn't like the term onshoring. She felt that term reshoring was better, because US needed to work with allies and other countries in the area of trade. Therefore, you need to reshore production away from China, but you can't onshore everything in the United States. So I think that is the dimension we have to look at, but we have to be careful. I think if the US blocked supply of raw materials for vaccines at some stage, that challenges the concept of supply chain reliability. Similarly, if in India, we block exports at a certain stage because we need them, be it in pharma sector, be it in other areas, sometimes even in agriculture, then others will question our reliability as a trusted supplier. So I think we need to keep these in mind. And my own sense would be that with partners like the US, or if you're looking at partners in the framework of the Quad, Japan, Australia, we should work for an arrangement whereby within the framework of strategic partnerships, there is commitment on all sides that sudden blocking of supplies would not be resorted to. And it can be solved politically. For example, when the Biden administration had difficulty right now in allowing the supplies for India, they said, India was with us last year. They helped us last year. Therefore, we must help India this time. So I think that kind of argument can be made, but these things needed to be cultivated with a sense of purpose and commitment to it.
Thank you, Arun Singh. That was quite a tour de force. But taking on from something you spoke about, which is Trump's vote in the 2020 elections, let me turn to Dr. Monish and ask him about the domestic drivers as he sees it in US foreign policy, what that means for India. We've seen not merely a Trump, the Trump vote being solid, we have the leftovers of the racism that we had seen during the Trump years continues. The US has difficult race issues today to deal with. The January 6th insurrection spoke of fissures within the democratic polity that we had not actually focused on earlier. Going forward with Joe Biden in a party that has the progressive left as well as the Republican right, what are the things that Joe Biden would have to look out for through this? But what would be the challenges? What would be the implications for US foreign policy? Dr. Manish.
Thank you, Chair. And I hope I'm audible. Yeah, thank you, Chair. And thank you to the organizing team at the Symbiosis School of International Studies for giving opportunity to a rookie academic like me to sit between such experienced hands who have looked at this relationship for a lot many years than I have done. So what I will do in the next 12 to 13 minutes will be to raise certain issues and raise questions rather of rethinking the shifting domestic base of US foreign policy in the 21st century. And I think I'll take off from what was the previous discussion about the vaccine issue between US and India. And it reminds me of what Winston Churchill once said, that you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted doing all other things, right? So, so how do we look at rethinking the domestic base of US foreign policy? And I think, how do we look at bumper sticker campaign slogans like Restoring America and America First? What are their real world implications of issues inside the United States, and what it means for America's engagement with the rest of the world? Herein, I would also draw attention to a report, a task force report that was prepared in Carnegie Endowment. So, I was drawing attention to a task force report that came out right in the middle of the campaign season last year at Carnegie, and which included the current National Security Advisor, Jack Sullivan. And I think this reference has come out in much of Biden's speeches also, which is US foreign policy for the American middle class. I think that's the buzzword as far as linking home and abroad is concerned in the strategic community in the United States, in the policymaking community, hashing it out and talking about what it means to make a foreign policy for the benefit of the American middle class and also for the working class. And what I think Professor Talmiz Ahmed was talking about in his speech about the ones who feel marginalized, the one who feels left behind. And I think nothing is more reflective of domestic American politics and the sentiments there than looking at who wins the best picture in the Oscars. And you can see Nomadland winning the Oscars best picture. And it's nothing but a reflection of hinterland America living left out, living marginalized, and how those sentiments have been engendered and have been magnified for political purpose, have been magnified during the elections that we saw with the rise of Trump as the president of the United States. So what are some of the issues, that aligns with what was being, what Ambassador Arun was talking about? What are some of the issues that I would point out? One is when we look at the domestic base in the United States and its linkage with foreign policy, one looks at identity, right? One looks at identity, the question of what it means to be Americans and whose America is it anyway? And that's exactly what we heard during the insurrection in January, when people were shouting in front of the Capitol, like, this is our America, this is not their America. And people inside the Congress were telling that what just happened outside, that's not our America, that's not the America that we present. So that raises the question, whose America is it anyway, and who represents this America? And when you keep talking about a stolen election, it's a phenomenal sort of I think, digression in how we look at US democracy, although very messy things have happened in the past in US democracy for sure. But the very connotation of looking at an election as a stolen election, and when a US president comes out and says that I am going to be the president of the United States, not only for those who voted for me, but also for those who didn't vote for me. Now, when more than 70 million people voted for the other guy, and many of them would not think that the election was won by Biden fair and square, what does it mean for the future of US democracy? That is one. The other thing is about economics, right? Thus, US standing in the international system, what does it mean? Does it necessarily mean better life for Americans back home? Does it mean job security for sizable number of Americans back home? Does it mean better infrastructure for the inner cities in America? So these are some of the questions that links American trade policy and American economic standing in the international system to how it really pans out inside America. And thus, that does bring me to the question of income inequality in America. That's something which has been talked about, much more right after the Occupy Wall Street movement took place, right? And if we talk about security, the question is, does America's role in international security, what does it mean for homeland security? And that's exactly what I think Ambassador was talking about, the withdrawal from Afghanistan and how threat perceptions within the United States, how it is discussed within the United States, it has an implication of how we as outsiders, other countries dealing with the United States have to navigate this alignment of threat perceptions vis-a-vis the United States. The other thing is about inclusivity, right? It's the question of whether US foreign policy is decided and made by very few. And that raises the question of race and gender within the US foreign policy mechanism and within the US decision-making mechanism. I think the next point is about innovation and competitiveness, specifically in technology, as was referred to, both civilian, military, and of dual nature, how that is going to lead to job creation in the United States, and how that is going to lead to skill development in the United States. And that raises a very important question about job creation and skill development in different parts of the United States, specifically in the Rust Belt economies, which were exactly the way for Trump to the White House. If you look at the upper portions of the Midwest, states in the US, and if you look at that, it raises the question of, has the US government taken care of a post-industrial American job market? Post the financial recession in America, are Americans skilled enough to take the jobs that are being created in the new environment, the software environment that Professor Ahmed was talking about, and also raises the question of the state of local economies in the US. There's a reason why in the Carnegie report on foreign policy for the middle class, the case study are from 3 states. They are from Ohio, they are from Nebraska, and they are from Colorado. Right? Very distinct local economies which were chosen to refer to when you talk about US foreign policy and middle class. The second point that I wanted to raise was this issue of modern American presidency and the new covenant between the presidency, which is the executive, and the people of the United States. And I would refer back to the starting of the modern American presidency right from the early parts of the 20th century, from Theodore Roosevelt, when went from newspapers to radio to television to social media, how the American president wants to connect with the American public without the filter of the institutional mechanism of media. I think this is a running theme in how a covenant is created between the US people and the American presidency. And I think Trump took it to a different level altogether with the kind of the use of social media that he was used to. And that raises the important question for, I think, any country that deals with American foreign policy making, which is the interface between the Congress and the executive, the US presidency. Now, here is the anomaly of the United States. United States has one of the most powerful presidencies in the world, but at the same time, which is highly influenced by the checks and balances and the constraints which are put on it by the US Congress. And I think this is a very important theme to understand in order to navigate the domestic politics of the US and what kind of policy making it comes up with. The other point that I wanted to make regarding American presidency was that every time there is a campaign season in the US, everyone comes out, even the one with a huge amount of money with political dynasties comes out showing that they are nothing but a regular guy who can connect with the American people. I feel that no one in the US election standing has their ancestors came to US with more than $4 in their pockets. So I think there is an insistence to show this connection between even a person like Donald Trump, a real estate developer who I don't think has any idea of what middle class America is all about. How did Trumpism connect with the American people? I think it connected because he showed this attitude of pushing back against the establishment, whichever way you look at it, right? And that's exactly the message that the American people took, I think. So the other anomaly is that at the ideational level, the US is all for free trade, but yet it is influenced highly by protectionist tendencies. How are we going to deal with it when we look at domestic base of US foreign policy making? And when we look at America first, I think it is a recurring back of the isolationist period of the interwar period. I don't think Trump knows too much about the interwar period, but I feel that his advisors knew exactly what they were doing when they were ramping up on America first. And the question that I wanted to raise at the end was that what does restoring America really represent when Biden talks about restoring America? On what level it needs restoring? What are the undercurrents that 4 years of Trump's presidency and perhaps a much longer socio-political dynamics that America has led to? What is he going to restore? What it will mean for America's engagement with the rest of the world? And at the end, I want to leave you with this question. And I think this is particularly important for India because in India, the first strategic question that we often ask when it comes to change of administration in the US in recent times is that how is it going to deal with the China challenge? And how is it going to behave with China? And the fear is that will it reconcile with China? There will be a conciliatory approach to China. The main question is, as the Biden administration goes about dealing with a post-pandemic, it's not even post, I won't use the word, but an economy ravaged by the pandemic and by the remnants of the financial crisis in different parts of America, while it builds the technological base, the economic base, while it deals with the political polarization, the racial divide in America, I think China is seen to be important, at least in the economic domain and at least at fighting challenges like the climate change. So does all of this restoring mean that there will be a conciliatory approach to China in the times to come? And I think that will be a big question for India as we look at what is the shifting domestic base in the US that informs foreign policy making. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Monish. It's interesting that you mentioned the question of climate change. And my question to you is this. Climate change, or rather the policies that are being crafted by the Biden administration to combat climate change, because climate change is occupies a huge part of Biden's both foreign policy as well as domestic policy. What, in your view, would be the impact of the polarized politics that we see in the US? How do you see that impacting this policy, both internally as well as externally?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am, for the question. I think, see, first of all, I'll point at three things. I think the major message that comes out from the Biden administration when you look at the post-leaders summit, the virtual summit, is um, still under the still under the umbrella of the Restoring America debate, which is that how do we restore US leadership on climate change issues that was apparently lost when Trump walked out of the Paris Climate Accord. So I think on a broader level, I think that's the message that is being passed out by convening that summit. To your question about polarization, I think it was immediately seen after the summit itself, when Republican policymakers, both in Senate and the Congress, representing certain constituencies with certain vested interests in the fossil fuel industry, came out in direct confrontation of the ambitious agenda that the Biden administration pointed out. I think it is ambitious by many scales, in the sense that the kind of targets that he has put for 2035 or 2050, I think doubles down on even the targets that the Obama administration would have thought to achieve. So I think there was an immediate reaction from the Republican policymakers, and it was, I think, not surprising, in the sense that what Trump tried to sort of bring out during his term was this idea, which was reflected even in the National Security Strategy paper, that here is an America which is energy dominant for the first time, and how that is going to impact not only American energy dependence, from the Middle East, for instance, right? So I think there is a change from that to talking about alternative energy forms, to talking about greener economy. I think much of the focus of what Anthony Blinken or Joseph Biden was talking about was that, look at the climate change in this way. There is economics in climate change, and if we don't do something about climate change, it's going to mean an economic doom for America. So I think the focus has been to bring out the connection between fighting climate change and an economic recovery, an economic revamping of the United States depending on a greener economy. Although, having said that, as I was trying to argue, that will be easier said than done, given the lobbies present in the United States from the fossil fuel industry, given the Republican policymakers who are already speaking out, and also the Democratic lawmakers who want him to do more, some of them. So I think he's going to be caught between Skyla and Charybdis when you talk about how to align these issues, at least not only in not only in achieving the commitments that he makes, but also how he aligns that with both developed and developing countries outside the United States. So, I mean, it's going to be a task cut out for the Biden administration.
Thank you, Dr. Monish. Both our speakers so far have taken a fairly detailed view of both domestic US politics and policies, as well as the kind of impact that it might have. But I would like Ambassador Navdeep Sarna, former ambassador to the US, to take a more of a bird's eye view and look at the coming decades to see how do you see the US evolving as a power in the coming decades, given where it is situated today, given the Chinese challenge, given the economic challenges, given the demographic challenges. How do you see the US evolving as a power? What are the challenges? What for you would be the red flags for India? What for you would be the green flags for India?
Well, thank you, Indrani, and thank you to the Symbiosis conference for inviting me. I am not new to this experience of coming after Ambassador Arun Singh. I replaced him in Israel as ambassador and then in the United States. And I know from experience that he doesn't leave any loose tags hanging, and usually is so thorough that there's not much left to say. I'm grateful to him for that. And of course, Dr. Monish has covered a lot of very important ground. So before I come to your question, if you don't mind, I'll just just point out a couple of thoughts that came to me to listening to these two very erudite interventions. I think, first of all, going to the immediate, that is the COVID response. I think besides what Arun said, it does highlight a couple of things about the United States, even on the bird's eye view angle. One, I thought the response that has come, of course, is welcome, but it's not complete. And there are several areas which have not been addressed. And I think just to pick one area is the whole entire issue of the generic vaccine exception being sought at the WTO, being opposed by the entire pharma lobby. In the typical American sense, over 100 lobbyists, very well-paid fat cat lobbyists, are walking around the Congress trying to stop that exception, unfortunately. So that, to me, that raises one question, that is America really back? Can America really come back beyond a slogan? And that's something which we have to watch out in the next few years. And the second point that it raises for me, particularly in a bilateral context, is how thinly balanced our public perception about the United States is. We change in a day. If 3 days there was if there was one insensitive comment by the State Department spokesperson, which was very insensitive, I must say, the entire Quad thing sort of falls apart. So we have to remember that in our Bible, because we have a history. We are carrying this 70 years of history, slights, delays, personality clashes in this relationship. Having said that, I think let's see where we are with the United States, and I won't repeat the details that have been mentioned, so I'll try to give you a broad brush thing. And here, I think particularly in the Trump years, the much maligned Trump administration was actually very good to us on strategic and defense issues. And we did make some strides, which I don't think we could have imagined even 5 years ago, 7 years ago, particularly in the defense side. We have actually now signed all the foundational agreements that matter. Our defense purchases have gone up to 20 billion, and they're largely the takeoff from what we have stopped buying from Russia in terms of percentage, and some, of course, has gone to Israel. And in strategic terms, the kind of involvement of India in the Indo-Pacific, in the national security strategy, et cetera, as the linchpin of the Indo-Pacific, is, I think, there to stay. Now, these are things which can't just change with one administration going and another coming. I mean, they may change in nuance, they may change in degree. But fortunately, what we have seen, and fundamentally because there is a continuity in the way United States is looking at China, our gains of the Trump years have been secured in the first 100 days of the Biden administration. And I think this is now for us. When I say us, I mean us and the United States, of course, to continue to build this. We haven't yet talked too much about the problems. And these are the problems which I think are going to be there in the years to come also. And when you said, what are going to be our red flags? You see, one of the good stories about India in the United States, I mean, Arun mentioned 3 or 4 points on which things coalesce, and he's perfectly right. I think there's one more point, and that point is India as an economic story. Is very attractive. I mean, one of the strongest institutions backing the Indo-US relationship 3 or 4 years ago was the US industry. Particularly important when Trump came in and when his honeymoon period with the US industry was working. It was that was the strongest lobby for better relations with India. Because India is seen as a market, India is seen as a possible supplier, India is seen as a very strong country in terms of professionals, India is seen as a possible base for third country production. Now, I'm afraid that part of it has not worked well. And partly it did not work well because of Trump's very transactional attitude towards trade and economic relations. Because he saw a lot of things in terms of trade balance. And India had a $25 billion positive trade balance. So we had to scurry around doing things like we'll buy oil, we'll buy gas, we'll buy more aeroplanes from Boeing, etc., to cut down that balance and make you look respectable. Now, that may or may not be the story with the Biden administration and subsequent administrations. We don't know, because so far they haven't yet come out talking on the trade issues with India. We have traditional market access issues. We have traditional intellectual property rights issues. We are still on the special 301 priority watch list. We have got issues on agriculture, cherries, apples, almonds, which go back to forever. I don't know if you've heard that story, but when Narasimha Rao visited Washington, D.C., and he was in discussions with Clinton, the relationship was so thin that they ran out of talking points. And then Clinton looked around and said to one of his advisors, I think to the USTR, why don't you say something? So he said, yes, almonds. So they started talking about almonds. We are still talking about those almonds. So there are those, traditional market accesses. Then there are issues of increasing protectionism from both sides. There are issues which are impacting localization of data, financial flows, e-commerce, all these issues, and these matter to the United. How is Amazon going to do business in India really matters in the United States. So I'm just trying to give you that these are sort of landmines around the place. So looking ahead, I mean, if you were to ask me, the United States, I don't think is going to just press a button and be back. It's going to take a lot of doing because the world has changed since Obama years. And in any case, Obama was already looking inwards, beginning to look inwards, though we don't remember that today. But what Biden is doing in Afghanistan was actually started not by Trump, but by Obama. So whether the US can come back to lead that so-called international liberal order, I don't know, frankly. I would not think it possible in the way that we imagined it in the 60s and 70s and 80s, because the world has moved on. Secondly, whether the US is going to be engaged in a way in different theaters in the world, certainly not. They are going to be picky about what they do. There is a fatigue about international exposure in the United States. And as the professor said, I mean, the kind of wave that carried Trump to the White House is a very real wave. It was not Trump's magic; he just struck it lucky. And that is a very real wave. The US, a large part of it, feel that they've been had in this whole globalization thing, and they really need to be looking about. I think in terms of, we have to look at a more insular, more inward-looking United States. We have to look at a more polarized, more divided United States. We have to look at a United States which will help us when it serves their interests. At the moment, there is an alignment and a convergence because of China. Now, whether this stays, for instance, this point was also mentioned, can they do a reset on China? At the moment, I would look at, if you want a red flag, I would look at climate change. The one place where they can easily do a reset or make a concessions to China is for gains in climate change, where China holds the cards and Kerry is desperate for a victory, and so is Biden. So I think our red flags are going to be whether they have a reset with China, whether our broad alignment of interest stays, and that's why we have to move fast. We have to move fast to do the reforms that are needed for bringing us into the supply chain circuit. We have to move fast in terms of setting up projects in the Indo-Pacific with the United States while the going is good. And we have to build our lobbies in the United States beyond Washington, D.C. I'm sure we are doing that, but that is the whole multi-stakeholder thing that Arun started off with. For instance, the critical thing about Russia. Now that's a reality. Today we have announced a 2+2 with Russia. So which shows that we are not ignoring that relationship. We cannot ignore that relationship. I think the big test for the Indo-US relationship is going to come when we get deliveries of the S-400. And whether or not the US administration makes a waiver case for India, and with how much conviction it makes that waiver case, I believe they will. It's in their interest to do so. But if they have to do so, and I think we have to be in the coming years, I think if you're saying, where are we going to be with all these countries? I think we are going to be in a very narrow place. We will constantly be having to balance the great power rivalries. And we have to make sure that we are more important to each of them so that they don't try to spoil our relationship with the other. I think in very vague terms, that's a very freewheeling answer to your question, but I'm happy to do follow-ups.
Thank you, Navtej. That was actually a very good sort of tour de horizon. But to catch you a little bit on what you spoke about climate change in China, and the fear in India being that, John Kerry is to Joe Biden what Zalmay Khalilzad was to Trump. That the pressure to do a climate deal with China could propel the US towards what the Obama administration flirted with in the first couple of years, which is a G2. And the G2 fear remains a real one within the Indian system. On the other hand, we don't really see the Chinese getting to a place where they might be able to do that deal with America. I don't see whether the Chinese themselves would like to do that deal with America. Instead, what I do see is pressure on India to declare a net zero. And the Chinese have been very clever and have declared a net zero without a credible path to that net zero. India has a very credible path, but it has not declared a net zero. So we are, I think, as you rightly said, we are in this sort of a narrow space. But there is, and which then leads you to ask ourselves this question, that there is something that we all have grown up with, which is strategic autonomy. Where does that particular term fit into today's politics or today's relationship between the US and India, where we are very clearly tilting towards the US. The US says that they are, they look at India with new eyes, that there is a new relationship being built. Where does that put our strategic autonomy? You also mentioned our importance with Russia. Yeah, no, so go right ahead.
On your first point on the climate change, I entirely agree with you. I think the pressure is going to build up on India, and it's going to build up in Glasgow. It's going to build up in, and frankly, I think we have to worry about climate change for our own good, not for United States, not for John Kerry. I think we have to be worried about what's happening. Yes, we are not the historical polluters, and we need the money, and we need the technologies to go green. I agree with all that, though that's been our traditional negotiating positions, and it's fine. But today, I think we have to be more creative. We have to do something dramatic. We have to change we have to knock off this chessboard. Otherwise, we are going to get played into one corner. We have to change the basics of this climate change, and we can do it by doing things ourselves. If we don't declare a net zero, maybe we ban plastic, and I believe we were very near doing that. So, but we didn't because of lobbies. But, so this is just an example, but my point is that we can be more creative. Kerry has made some remarks, for instance, that he's ready to make a consortium of some countries to fund India going green, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let's take him on that. And let's see how much, we can actually change. But I think a lot of it needs, particularly after the pandemic and the way it's played out in India, I think we should be doing things for our own sake. On the second aspect of strategic autonomy, I don't think we have a choice. We are not going to become an ally of the United States. We cannot become an ally of the United States. And I think somewhere the United States knows that well. So I think, yes, at the moment we are tilting because our interests are converging. But then every few days we sort of tilt back a little. We get Lavrov over and we talk, and then we've done the 2+2, and then we are going to we take the S-400 no matter what. So at the moment it's only between Russia and the US, because at the moment we are kuti with China, and at we are less cautious about annoying China than we were a year and a half ago because of what's happened in Ladakh. So, so this is something, but this, Indrani, this as well as I do. This is a treadmill. This cannot be fixed, stopped, and say, okay, now this is done. I've told them I'm strategically autonomous, so it's fine. No, it's a treadmill. It's a daily job. It's what diplomats are for. It's what envoys are for. It's what media, has to be tackled. It is where you have to be talking to the Congress. You have to be talking to the diaspora to make yourself, yes, this is India's space. Oh, yes, they will buy this from Russia, but still they are our friends. Now, with how much skill we do that is really us. Because in a way, we are sui generis. We are not a NATO ally. We are not a subservient ally. We like to be friends with a lot of people, but that takes tact, it takes skill, it takes time.
Thank you both. There are a couple of questions that are popping up. So do post your questions in the chat box. So the first couple of questions, there's one question for Arun Singh, which I will direct to you, Navtej, which is the activation of great power rivalry between the US and China is palpable. however, the present pandemic shows that there are issues of non-traditional security. So how far should the state be, should the state alone shoulder the responsibility of security provision, or should extra state or non-state entities be involved? I think the answer to that is pretty simple, because if we allow the functions of the state to be taken over by other entities, but I'd ask you to, it just says that the activation of great power rivalry between the US and China is palpable. However, the present pandemic and other such unconventional threats are issues of non-traditional security. How far is a state-led approach feasible without participation from the extra state or communities in today's day and age? So should the state alone be the one responsible for shouldering the provisions of security?
In terms of the US-China?
In terms of US, or just in a generic way, in terms of all states?
Well, I think that's a very complicated question to give one simple answer. In terms of all states, I mean, there are certain duties and obligations that a state has, which only the state should be fulfilling. And if the state does not fulfill, then it's failing in its duty. But then there is a role for civil society, there is a role for industry, there is a role for the media, there is a role for NGOs, there is a role for the courts, frankly, and we are seeing it all play out in India today, and I'm sure this would happen in any functioning democracy. I don't know if it works in China that way, but for the US, certainly this kind of a thing. But a state has very well-defined roles which it should fulfill.
There is another question directed at you. What do you think the Biden administration's position will be in resolving the crisis in the WTO? And what would be the implications for the global South?
Well, I think if you're referring to the vaccine issue.
The appellate body, the appellate body, which is now in tatters.
Yes. On the broader issue, I don't think the USTR has really yet come out with any pronouncements that indicate the direction of the policy. Not that I have seen. I may have missed some in the last few days. But I think the Biden administration, if it really wants to, I don't know what they will do, but what they should be doing, if they want to fulfill the campaign promise of America's back and as America is going to lead, and I think they have to take a more constructive view, not only of the WTO, but also engage in a much better fashion than the Trump administration did with all the multilateral institutions. I mean, yes, they have restored their assistance to WHO, and they are going to go back to the human rights and UNESCO and all that, but they have to actually show up and be counted. Something which has been missing for the last 4 years. So I would think that given the campaign indications, the Biden administration should take a more constructive role at building up WTO again. But then again, it's not something which only the US can do. This, the WTO, in view of many countries, needs a reconstruction, needs a rethink. And I think things have to come together, where, of course, the US will play a very important role.
Sure. Dr. Monish, there's a question for you here, which is how would you say the security law in Hong Kong impact Western interests in the region, especially on trade?
Okay. I think that there is something that the Biden administration has to come up with more specifics in the days to come. That has, I mean, it's sort of kind of natural that the US whenever things like those happen, whether it's in Hong Kong, especially in Hong Kong, there is an expectation from the American administration to uh, act in a certain way. To what extent it can act is something that is highly constrained by the nature of U.S.-China relations. Uh, there is no specific instance by which one can really put a finger on it and say that this is how the Biden administration is going to really come up with things. I think more than Hong Kong, the issue that I think really is going to be a matter of matter of tension between the US and China would be the Taiwan issue rather than the Hong Kong issue. I think how the Hong Kong issue and the protest was handled was largely in terms of to what extent other countries can comment and what other countries can do, how China deals with protests or issues like that in the internal dynamics of Hong Kong. So I don't think in the coming days Hong Kong protests or what happened in security law in Hong Kong is going to be much of a priority issue in the Biden administration. But I would point my finger more to the Taiwan issue rather than pointing to the Hong Kong.
Correct. Because second question for you, in fact, there are two questions for you. If you would comment on the rise of or the future of white supremacists in the US, and whether with the renewed wave of Black Lives Matter and Asian American movement, how far do you think racial inclusivity will be part of or not of US foreign policy?
From a direct foreign policy influence, I think it's more about, rather than having a direct, let's say, impact on policy making vis-a-vis other countries, when it comes to issues like Black Lives Matter, I think the issue is more about American image and how other countries see how the American democracy has dealt with issues like that. Uh, if we look at issues like the BLM issue and the rise of white supremacists, there are other issues related to it, which is about law enforcement. It's about police brutality in the US, and whether it's from a highly domestic issue, it's also about city zoning inside the United States in terms of black neighborhoods and other things, and the kind of job opportunities or skill development that is required in most of those neighborhoods, which are largely populated by blacks. So when we look at Black Lives Matter, I don't think there is a direct foreign policy import of it affecting America's relations with other countries. I think it's more of a question of what does that do to how America represents itself as this citadel of democracy and all those things, and how the Biden administration in the days to come is going to deal with these racial tensions in the US, which, if it does not affect foreign policy, it does affect the environment in which the Biden administration is going to do policy making. When you have Black Lives Matter protests all over cities in the United States, when you have China, for instance, picking up on this, and other countries picking up on news about police brutality and killing of blacks in American neighborhoods, that's going to be a nuisance for the Biden administration to deal with while making policies. So I don't think it's a direct impact on, policy making vis-a-vis other countries. It's more of a question of what do you do with this kind of things which directly impact the image of America. which directly impacts the more, I would call it, the non-tangible elements of American power, rather than the more tangible elements of American power, like military or economics. So these are less tangible elements of American power. So that's how I see it.
Right. If I can ask both of our speakers to give quick closing remarks before we end for today. Dr. Navtej, you go first.
I think, if you sort of pull the lens back and look at it overall, I think today the India-US relationship is in as good a place, or perhaps better than it has ever been. And it's we have to remember that this is a culmination of a upward movement over the last 20 years or more. The strength lies in a greater knowledge about each other, in a greater understanding about each other, in a greater comfort with each other. So the issues of history in many ways have been left behind. There are niggling issues still, but I think the broader convergence of strategic interests, the logic of the strategic partnership, the possibilities, if not the full realization of potential of the economic relationship, and the ever-increasing sort of significance of the Indian American community in the United States. I mean, all put together have really now brought us to a place where the fundamental logic of the relationship is not questioned. The fundamental rationale of being largely on having the same worldview is not questioned. There is no knee-jerk reaction, though, as I said, it is not very far from the surface in India about the United States. But we have, brought the relationship somehow to that point. Challenges remain because we are in a multipolar world. Our partnerships often tend to contradict each other. It's a complex situation, and that will be the challenge. Challenges remain in terms of engagement in a globalized world, when the word globalization itself has come under question. So these are challenges of protectionism, the need to engage, the need to reform, all that still remains. So overall, I think today a very wide, very multi-layered relationship, which ultimately is to our benefit, given the inner strengths of the United States, the ability, the technology, the materials, the resources, the influence that the United States wields in the world. I think it's a good partnership for India to have.
Okay.
Dr. Manish.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Chair. One or two things I more of like follow to what Ambassador Sarna has been trying to point out. The first thing is that I really believe that US-India relationship is at a positive arc. There's a broader positive arc, although there are hitches here and there. And that positive arc, I think, has to do a lot with the institutional linkages that have been developed over the years between the two countries, which is, proof from change of administrations in the United States. The next thing is, I think, referring to my own presentation on the domestic constituencies, I think there is a better need in India to, among the younger crowd also, from the younger crowd to the middle career levels and above. And as an academic, I think, let me push it this way, that I think in the study of the United States in India, I feel there is much more energy that is required, much more a long view of the understanding of the US as such, which is required, the interface between the legislature and the executive, understanding of that, functioning of lobbies. I think we need to take India-US relation, in US studies a little bit beyond understanding, beyond the bilateral, and sort of broaden understanding a little bit. That's my academic point of view. But beyond that, I wanted to answer the question on strategic autonomy and maybe end with that. I believe that, I believe because there is so much of debate about leaving behind non-alignment and then taking up strategic autonomy and all those things and commentaries, I believe that strategic autonomy is really the undercurrent operating principle of Indian foreign policy, whether you are talking about non-alignment or multi-alignment. And I believe that there is a way to practice strategic autonomy even in the Quad. So I feel that as it is our strategic autonomy to decide whether it is good or bad to go along with the United States at a certain point of time in history, I think it is in our strategic autonomy also decide to go with the United States when it serves our purpose. So going along with the United States, I don't think should be equated with squandering strategic autonomy and practicing of that flexibility that is inherent in strategic autonomy. And to sort of add to that, I think I take away from what Ambassador Sarna was referring, that there is a cost to be paid for great power relations. And I think the point about it is whether we are engaging with Russia or whether we are engaging with US, or what happens to our relationship with Iran because of the US-India relationship. I think there's a cost to be paid for great power relations. The point is to have an understanding of, can we anchor that cost? What is that cost that we are going to pay when we engage with the United States? And I think we need to be mindful of all of this as we navigate the challenges in the future of India-US relationship.
Thank you very much. The last word I will leave for Dr. Lavale. So if you could give us your words of wisdom.
Thank you, Indrani. First of all, I would just like to thank all of you, Ambassador Sarna, Ambassador Arun Singh, who had to leave, and of course, Dr. Monish. But last but not least, Indrani, thank you very much for moderating the session. I think there were lots of takeaways for all of us. But what really resonated with us, and particularly with, I'm sure, with the university, is the need for area studies. Particularly, Dr. Monish, you talked about, understanding the US, or for that matter, even other countries of the world or other geographical regions of the world. So this is, in fact, for us, a big takeaway for the future when we talk about, coming up with new courses, or for that matter, opening new departments, or for that matter, new programs. So thank you very much. And to all participants, please log in tomorrow at 10 a.m. for, again, a wonderful day of very, very interesting sessions. Thank you. Thank you very much. And have a great evening.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you.